The scripture reading this morning will be taken from Luke chapter 15, verses 16 through 20. Luke chapter 15, verses 16 through 20. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare? And I perish with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him.
Certainly good to be with you. And I always love when I have props. My wife encouraged me to bring this prop. It'll make sense here in a little bit. But good to have you with us this morning. And I always like preaching on things that are relevant to what's going on in my life. And been spending a fair amount of time visiting with Dad here lately. And anybody that's went and seen him, seen how much weight he's lost, and you know, he's been in a lot of pain, and clearly, if you have any time to talk to him, he's like, Rick, I'm not getting any better. He clearly thinks this is it. I mean, he looks a lot better to me now than he did a month ago. I mean, he's still, you know, he's not healthy, and he barely get around, but you just never know. I can tell you, in just talking to him, there's a lot of reflection there, and there's things he's got that he has. He wants to make sure those are going to certain people, and just caused me to think a lot about even my own self in my life story, and the question of how will you be remembered? And I think, as you'll notice, I go through this lesson, a lot of thoughts there that I think they're important. It's funny, when I start on a lesson, I start working on it. By the time I get toward the end, I'll be like, man, I know I've talked about that before. Sometimes you circle back around, you get to the same point you made, and you may see a couple slides, they're totally different, but they make the same points maybe I made in a lesson 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's funny how those things circle back around. And I was talking to Sue, she said, "You're not going to talk about ancestry again." Yes, I am going to talk about ancestry again today. But a much different way. So what we leave behind. And when you think about, this is just the beginning of the ancestry. I actually have ancestry traced way back, and probably many in this audience actually are in this tree at some point in place. And I'll actually talk about one of those here in a little bit, and it wasn't planned necessarily. Obviously, I'm thinking about the Mayu family at this point in time, but I'm related to them, and I'll explain to you how that I am related to them. So this chair is the oldest thing in this building. Now, I know that with surety because this chair belonged to my great grandfather, Peter Lucas. At least that's what my grandma told my dad. And so this chair belonged to him. And believe it or not, Dad said he had to, and I couldn't believe it, because anybody knows my dad, he's not what Gary consider finished carpenters. He's more of a rough carpenter. But he apparently fixed the arm on this chair, or replaced it. And he redid, now this I believe, he redid all the seating on. Anybody knows my dad's weaved oak baskets, and he's done. And so my dad fixed that chair. It's that piece of leather just keeping it from going back too far, but it works great. You can sit in it and rock. And I don't know how many of my ancestors were rocked in that chair, but I think a fair number of them. And so that chair was given to, went from Peter to Louis Lucas. So I don't know Louis. And that was given to my grandpa, Dale and Thelma. So grandma had that chair, and then it was given to Dad. And then finally Dad just gave this to me. And I think just because of my love of ancestry, and I'm talking about and he said, "Hey, I got a chair down in the basement, belonged to Peter Lucas." And so also use this chart just to bring something else out, is that, you know, there's things that I have that belong When dad passes on, he's got all these things he wants to give to his kids. And I'm sure there's things that you have belong to your parents. You might be fortunate and have a few things from your grandparents. But I can tell you, everybody in this column over here, Peter, Lucas, I have this. I didn't have this, but anybody else on that, some of these folks I don't even know and certainly don't have anything that was left to me that belonged to them. And this is an important point of the lesson is really, what do you leave behind and what are you going to be remembered for? I can tell you it's only going to last a few generations. The physical things that you give to your kids and grandkids are not going to go very far, and it's just going to go away. Like I said, this is one of the exceptions to the rule, which is why this means a lot to me, this little chair here. How soon we are forgotten. I'm also going to talk about these two people here in a little bit. And this is where I'll talk about Mayhews a little bit, but John Bunning and Lucetta Morse, I'm going to talk about them a little bit. So remember those two names. I'll come back to them in just a second, but that was my grandma Thelma's grandparents, John Bunning, Lucetta Morse. And so when we look at the thought, everyone leaves a story behind. We know that it says by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. It says, through which he obtained a testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. And a thing that I want to get across to you today is one of the only thing that really speaks after you're long dead and gone is the life that you lived and the example that you set. And you're going to see, I think, and I'll convince you that how far that influence goes through the test of time. But we can see here, even the Bible talks about that even though Abel was dead, he spoke. So we go back to this example, even how many thousands of years later, and say, you know what? Abel sacrificed because he offered it to God by faith. And so the question here is, what story will speak long after you're gone? So I want you to think about that question as we go through today's lesson. What lesson and what's going to be spoke about you long after you leave this earth? That's actually the tombstone of John Bunning and Loretta. We'll talk about them here a little bit more, but how will I remember? Will you leave people trying to unravel your life to determine who you really were and what you're really all about? One of the things I like to do when I go to funerals is I go, and I don't know if you do this, I look at all the pictures. I look at pictures when they were younger, or even their kids. And what I find when I go to the funerals, there's things that I learn about folks I never knew. People that were important to them, really important to them, I didn't know anything about that in their life. But you know what I also realized is I knew that person as well. And there's a side of that person that I knew that nobody else really knew about them. As Christians, we have relationships with folks in here, and you have relationships with other people that I don't know, but I have that relationship with them. And so it's one of the things I really appreciate about going to funerals, really getting to know people a little bit better, especially people you just know a little bit. And really understand who a person was. You can really learn a lot actually about a person after they're dead and gone. Will the question be, were you a lost soul wandering through life, no sense of purpose, no aims or goals, little to no or little impact on others that you were around? And so and there in verse Matthew 25 and verse 25 says, so I was afraid and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. Remember the parable of the talents. Are you one of those folks that God gave you all this talent and ability, but you just never applied it, never used it? And there are a lot of folks that go to their graves, go to funerals, and they had so much talent, so much ability, and then they squandered it. They wasted it. Or they like the one talent man saying he just buried his talent. He had the talent, or she had so much talent, and yet they didn't use it. Different stories are going to be told. And there are different stories told when you go to a funeral home. Sad stories. 1 Kings 11:4 says For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. And remember, those strange wives came in and they led Solomon astray. And they're sad stories, folks, that had things happen in their lives. And they talk about, and when you go to they go to the funeral home and they start talking about it, they're going to talk about all the crazy things that you did. They're going to talk about how great a father or mother you were. I know you've gone there, and I've heard, folks talk about how great a person this person was, even more than I knew about. Well, they talk about how unselfish of a person you were. People tend to only focus on the good things when you go to a funeral home. I don't know if you notice that. But I can tell you, in the dark and after the funeral home and all that, I can tell you, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, people are more influenced by the bad things that you've done in your life than the good things, unfortunately. Those bad things that you've done, the lying, the cheating, the adultery, the drunkenness, the abuse, those things had far more reaching, damaging effects than all the good things that individual did. It's sad, but it's just true. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed to Thessalonica. There in 2 Timothy 4:10. So will that be your story? You know what? They were faithful, and then they left the church, and they never came back. What a tragic story about Demas. He had it. He had salvation. He had eternity. And he lost it. The world got a hold of him. There's some stories we don't know. They're in 1 Timothy 5 or 2 Timothy 4, or 1 Timothy 5 and 24 and 25 says the sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious. And even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. I've heard stories about people that come out after they die and they're dead and gone. There's things people know about them, and sometimes that comes out eventually, right? These stories. The Bible there in 1 Timothy 5 talks about that. There's stories about that person people know, and then there's other things that they did that come out of, they don't stay hidden forever. And then the story we want to be told, right? We want the story of finishing strong. That we fought all of the way. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give unto me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them that also love his appearing. And what a blessing it is to go to a funeral and that person fought all the way. You always worry about, people being faithful for a time and then falling away at the end. If you watch a race, I know many people participate in track, and somebody's leading all the way, in the last 100 yards, they just die. They lose smoke, lose their steam, and they lose the race. We got to fight all the way to the end, and what a blessing it is. And when you go to a funeral, it should be a happy time when somebody fought the fight and they finished the course. They went all the way, and they never let the devil or the world get a hold of them. What a blessing that is, and something that we should strive for. So what is our legacy? A righteous man who walks in his integrity, how blessed are his sons after in Proverbs 20:7. Well, they remember you were a man or a woman of integrity. And they say integrity is what you do when nobody's watching you, right? The definition of integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. When I looked up the definition of moral, you won't find in today's definition, in Webster and online, God mentioned anywhere. But God is the definition of morality. God is what defines what is moral and not. But will people look at you and say they were honest? They had strong moral principles, moral uprightness. And so what are we leaving behind? A bad legacy, on the other hand, requires no concerted effort for attainment. We don't need to do anything different. The son or daughter is going to receive exactly what the parent left behind. Like water flowing downhill, so a bad legacy will pass effortlessly from one generation to the next. Ruin of a great person. It says, dead flies make a perfume's oil stink. So little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. It takes far less to ruin something than it takes to create it. You can say, well, Rick, I was good most of the time. Most of the time I was good. But it's the bad things that carry a lot more weight and are a lot more destructive than the good things that we do. And I'm going to prove that to you through this little example. Adolf Hitler. If I said that name, I think everybody in here would cringe, right? When maybe in a lot of people's mind, the worst person that ever walked on the face of the earth. But he did a lot of good things. I bet you don't know even one of these good things that he did. Nobody talks about him, right? He was, he was actually the first ever national environment protection law. Adolf Hitler put that in place in Germany. He had a place there where he brought animals in and preserved and protected animals. They had a program for children that actually helped less fortunate families. He assisted them financially. It was called Kindergeld. Sounds a lot like kindergarten, doesn't it? It was called Kindergeld. And it was money that was set aside for these less fortunate children who didn't have as much money. Lung cancer. The most common cancer today, Adolf Hitler, it was illegal to smoke. It was banned. Did you know that? Autobahn. Anybody ever been into Europe, Germany? Went on the Autobahn? It is the best road system in the world. Adolf Hitler created the Autobahn there in Germany. Volkswagen was an automotive company that he created. He did. And so the question is, if I were talking about Adolf Hitler, is he good or bad? This is all good things, right? In fact, you go online, you'll see all these great things that he did for young kids. He actually did a lot of good things in his life. But what's he remembered for? What's he remembered by? And I just bring that up to tell you how important it is that we recognize the bad things, and the bad things we do in our lives is what we many times we're remembered by. And we can see that in Adolf Hitler. And so now my story, and Nathan and all the Mayu Anderson's back there appreciate this. So Bunning, John Bunning was, I think, my great-great-grandfather. And you can read in there, it says, in early age, Mr. Bunning became a member of the Valley Church of Christ near Kalis. And in the obituary, it says the death of Mrs. John Bunning, highly esteemed Highland Avenue resident, occurred at her home early Tuesday morning following an illness of several weeks. Lucetta Morris Bunning, a daughter of Thomas and Carolyn Morris, was born February 11th, 1872 in Monroe County, where she lived an early life. She had been a lifelong member of the Church of Christ and was zealous in her belief. And when I trace back, in my lineage, to folks that taught my family to go to church, and it was important to have that, it really traces back to her. And it may even track back to her mother. Her mother died when she was 28 years old. So I don't have pictures of her, but I have pictures of her sister, who Thomas must have married. But you can see her, that picture that you see there. I got a pointer there. I looked on there and I saw that on Ancestry, and you know who it was posted by? Joe Mayu. And I'm thinking, okay, why would Joe Mayu be posting that picture of my great-great-grandmother up there? We're going to get to that here in a second. But and the point I'm making is the influence that she has, even to the members, people in this church. You'll be amazed how many people in this church were actually descendants or had some impact by her faithfulness to God. But that's not true of everyone, right? And just some points here I want to make is, what if we didn't receive anything? What if my parents didn't instill this in me? And what if I didn't have the godly upbringing you had, Rick? Well, I like this comment, if we received an empty wallet, we're the ones to fill it. At some point in time, somebody had to start this, right? I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was Lucetta or it was her mother or who it was, but somebody had decided they were going to commit their life to God. If we were the first to obey Christ as Lord in our family chain, we need not be the last. Maybe you're the one. Maybe you're the one to start the chain or keep the chain going. If we experience negativism and I can't, we can pass on positivism and I can't. I have so much respect for folks that have, in spite of their upbringing, have overcome much and are zealous for God and recognize how important God has been in their lives. And so this is Mayu Family Tree, which you'll see there. Maxine, I didn't have Melinda and all the kids in there, but you knew where you fit in that ancestry chain. Well, Maxine's mom was Belva. Belva's mom was Martha Bunny. Martha was Maggie Bunny's sister, who was my great-grandmother. And I am sure, with 100% certainty, that Martha and Maggie were taught by their mother, Lucetta, the importance of being a Christian and living a godly life. And that was passed on to Belva. It was also passed on to my grandmother, Thelma, who passed that on to her kids. And so obviously, and I didn't talk about the Anderson influences, but, my mom met my dad, was converted to Christ. My mom converted her brother Mike back there to Christ. And so when you actually go back from the very beginning and think, when Lucetta lived her life and just the influence that she had on her children and the amount and how far that disperses over time, the amount of impact that has is actually unbelievable to think about. And so can you see how important your influence is during your life and how it can have long-lasting effects on not just folks around you today, but generations to come? And you may say, well, Rick, I really never had a chance. I wasn't as fortunate. My mother, grandmother didn't teach me about God. We talk about perpetual victims. There's folks just born into bad situations. And like I said, I have so much respect for folks who have overcome so much. My grandma, my Aunt Charlotte, my dad, my Aunt Dana, Uncle Bruce, they had to overcome a lot when they were kids. Fortunately, I talk about my grandma Thelma and the great influence she was, but they had a tough life too. Alcohol made my dad's childhood a nightmare. And I can tell you stories my dad shared with me about his childhood, and it wasn't pretty. And I can tell you there was never even a drop of alcohol in our house the entire time I was a kid. And you know why? Obviously he was a Christian, but my dad saw what it did to his family and how bad it was. There wasn't a drop of anything in our house. I can tell you that. And he influenced me. And I try to influence my children as well about this danger. People forget about the real danger that's lurking out there. The world, the devil, will try to make you think that it's not so bad. There in Joshua 24:15 says, if it seems evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers who served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And as I mentioned, the devil is trying to get you to think about these things, and they're not so bad. In fact, you'll see movies out here that glorify how great it is. Parties. I could put up hundreds of movies up here that make this look like it's all fun and game. It's all great. It's all exciting. It's all fun. Drunk parents, right? This is funny. And you see some of these pictures down below. That's real life. Men who beat on their wives and abuse their children. That actually was caused by babysitter, by the way, that young baby there which I was glad about, but things that they do, that causes them to do that. What are you going to remember? I can tell you right now what these kids are going to remember. And what that wife's going to remember about her husband when she goes to his funeral. So how will you be remembered? What will your children and grandchildren remember about you? They remember that you were sinful, hateful, you're lazy, you're a liar, unstable, cursing all the time, always busy, couch potato, screaming, like to fight, cold-hearted, bad friends. Is that what they're going to remember about you? Or are they going to remember things like, you know what? He was faithful. He always told the truth, or she always told the truth. They were one of the most loving people I ever met. You know, you could really count on him and her. Spent time with their family. They were prayerful, really worked hard, and so warm and kind-hearted. So what are they going to remember about you? I can tell you what I want to remember by not the first. So will you leave a legacy of love? You know, did God always come first? Matthew 22:36-40 says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And he said, the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. And so will folks look at you and say, you know what? They really had a love for God. Not only for God, they loved their neighbor. You know, my dad's real good about taking care of, if you're willing to work, my dad will take care of you. It doesn't matter how much money you have, where you came from. You don't have to have a really sophisticated resume, or even, you can be even a pretty shady individual. And he'll hire you to do work for him. I always appreciated and respected my dad for that. Do we love our neighbors? Do we love God? Do we love the truth? In 2 Thessalonians 2:10, it says, "And with all wicked description for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved." And so it takes more than being a good person. We got to do what's right, and we got to know what the truth is. So do we love the truth? Do we love our enemies? This is a tough one. Matthew 5:44 and 45 says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." You know, that's a real hard thing. How did you treat your enemies? You know, you really got back. Anybody double crossed him, or anybody crossed him or her, man, they really got back at him. Or did they truly love their enemies? Do we love the brethren? 1 John 4:11. "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." Do we have, and will it be said, that we had such a strong love for our brothers and sisters in Christ? There's many folks that attended here that have gone on, and I went to their funeral, and I love them. There's a love and a compassion that you have there for them. And so will we leave a legacy of love? Will folks look at us and say, you know, that truly was a loving person? Will they remember a happy place? You know, Psalms 127:4-5 says, "Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons born in one's youth. Happy is the man who has filled his quiver with them." You know, children are such a blessing to parents and bring joy and happiness to parents. Do we return that blessing to them? You know, I remember when I was a kid how hard we worked. I always remember that. We worked hard, but also, you know what? Dad always played with us. We always had board games that we played. You know, he spent time with us. I mean, he was not selfish with his time. We pretty much were together all the time, either working or playing and doing something. You know, I can remember, not too often, but I remember a couple of times Mom and Dad having an argument about some things. I remember thinking, man, I hope that ain't too serious. You know, I don't think dad and mom would get it. Well, I can't imagine what it's like to live in a house and children living in a house where parents are fighting all the time. I know it happens. There's like half the marriages end in divorce. But you know how stressful that it could be on a child to see how the mom and dad are screaming and yelling at each other all the time. Doesn't mean we're not going to disagree, right? But I'm just telling you, find a quiet place to go have those discussions. Don't do it in front of your children, please. You have no idea how serious that is to them. That's their world, right? Mom and dad splitting up is like, that's everything. Home should be a happy place. The world, they go out in the world, that's where all the stress and the conflict and difficulties. But when they come home, it should be a place of peace. A place where they're happy. And I hope you're giving your children that. There's no greater blessing can you give your children than to have a happy home for them to come home to. All Christian parents should be concerned about the memories their children will have at home. This should be important to us. Memories of his father's home and what motivated the prodigal son. We looked there and the son was out and he spent all his dad's money and he's like, you know what? I remember what it was like at home. I didn't have to worry about food when I was at home. My father's servants eat better than I'm eating right now. And so what do our children think about when they leave home? The rich man's memories of wasted opportunities will haunt his mind for all eternity. There in Luke 12:25, it says, but Abraham said, son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. Impressions made early in our lives, whether good or bad, will be powerful in shaping the lives of our children. That's such an impact on them. And so if you have children in your home, it's so important that we leave them with good memories and good examples of how they are to be. You know, always remember how important it was for us to go to church. You know, there are things that my dad is concerned about leaving us. But I can tell you the greatest present that we can give them is our presence in spiritual activities. Children see our presence and absence. They'll use our presence as encouragement to present themselves and our absence as a license not to be present as well. And the greatest teacher of all is the example set before them. And like I said, I can tell you when it was time to go to church, you better be in the car. I think I've told this story. My son Josh was staying with mom and dad, and it was time to go to church, and Josh could not find his shoes, he found one shoe. He couldn't find the second shoe. You know, he had to come to church with one shoe. And you don't know Josh at that age. He's easily traumatized. I think he was traumatized for over a year. He had to come to church with one shoe on. He probably did a good job hiding it. But that's the way we were, man. When it was time to go to church, you better get ready because we were leaving. We were always going to be at church. You didn't have to ask, are we going to church tonight? I bet that's a question some of the kids ask their parents. Are we going to services tonight? I can tell you, never had to ask that question in my house. I knew when it was time for church, you better be in the car. We're leaving. And we're going to be on time. That was just, and I'm not saying being late's necessarily wrong. There's just certain people. My dad was on time. He always wanted to be on time. So we left early. Them 10 minutes early was late. But I always remember that about him. And there's things Dad's talking to me about. He's got a coin collection and he's got this knife collection. He said, Gary, it'll take you and Gary 3 or 4 days to find all the knives in this house. I believe that's true. He knows all the knives he has and who gave him certain knives. He's got stories about all these knives and just going through all that. But you know, Proverbs 13:22 says, a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children. The greatest thing he's done for me and his children was he carried that chain on and passed on the importance of God, living godly and faithful to God. That's the important thing he's leaving behind. These things, now this thing will last a little while. Hang on to it. It's important to me. I don't know if my kid or grandkid or somebody along the line is going to say, hey, let's just throw that thing out and get rid of it. Most of these physical things are gone that were owned by my grandparents and great grandparents. But that influence will carry on for generations and generations. And so I'll leave you with this last slide. It says, probably my favorite verse in the Bible, but as written, I have not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. This is why. This is why we make God first and such a priority in our lives, is because it's not about these things on earth. It's about what comes beyond the grave. And that's that great home that you can't even imagine how great, how glorious it is. You cannot imagine in your wildest dreams. You haven't seen anything on this earth. We've seen some beautiful things, but you've not seen anything close to what God has prepared for us. That's it. That's all I got for you. If you're in the audience, never been obedient to Christ, I encourage you to do that. Come forward, believe in Jesus, repent of your sins, make that great confession, and be baptized. And if your needs of prayers of the brethren, if you need to repent of sin or just confess some sins that we'd like for us to pray for you about, we can assist you anyway. Please come while together we stand and while we sing.